The dust of the high plain settled on Jonah's shoulders, a fine red powder that clung to everything he owned. He stood by the lonely stagecoach stop, a single weathered bench under a merciless sun, his gaze fixed on the shimmering horizon. He'd sent the letter and the money 6 months ago, a transaction that felt both desperate and practical. A wife. Not for love, not really, but for companionship, for an end to the crushing silence that defined his life on the sprawling ranch he'd carved from the unforgiving land. The advertisement had promised a respectable woman from the East, named Anna, looking for a steady husband and a new start. He was a simple, honest man, and he expected a simple, honest arrangement. When the coach finally rattled into view, a tired, lumbering beast kicking up a cloud of ochre, his heart hammered a steady, hopeful rhythm against his ribs. The driver pulled the horses to a halt, grunting a weary greeting. The door creaked open, but it wasn't the woman from the photograph who emerged. Instead, 2 young Chinese women were nudged out, stumbling into the dirt. They were dressed in worn but clean traveling clothes, their dark eyes wide with a mixture of terror and defiance. The younger one, barely a woman, clung to the elder's arm. Pinned to the elder sister's dress was a crude, hastily scrawled note. Jonah stepped forward, his brow furrowed in confusion, and plucked it free. The words were a slap in the face, a 2-for-1 bargain. Enjoy the joke, a cruel, dismissive scrawl. The stagecoach driver spat a stream of tobacco juice and refused to meet his eyes. That's them, he muttered. Paid for and delivered before Jonah could form a response, the coach lurched away, leaving him alone with the 2 silent, frightened strangers under the vast, empty sky. His hope curdled into a cold, hard anger, not for his own disappointment, but for the casual cruelty of it all. He looked from the note to the women. The elder one met his gaze directly, her chin held high, a silent fire in her eyes that dared him to be as cruel as the man who had sent them. In that moment, the loneliness he had hoped to cure was forgotten, replaced by a raw, protective instinct he hadn't realized he possessed. Before he could even speak, to offer them water or some semblance of an explanation, the sound of hoofbeats thundered from the direction of town. A trio of riders crested the nearby rise, moving with an arrogance that spoke of unchecked authority. The man in the lead was large and florid, his bulk straining the buttons of his vest, a silver star pinned crookedly upon it. Sheriff Barlow. The other 2 were his deputies, men with mean, empty eyes who flanked him like vultures. Barlow reined in his horse, a sneer twisting his lips as he took in the scene. Well now, Jonah, he drawled, his voice thick with false bonhomie. Looks like my property found its way to you. Appreciate you holding M for me, he gestured dismissively toward the 2 sisters, who flinched and drew closer together. Jonah's hand instinctively drifted to the worn leather grip of the Colt Peacemaker at his hip. They aren't property, Barlow, he said, his voice low and steady. And they're not yours, the sheriff chuckled, a wet, unpleasant sound. Oh, but they are. 1M fair and square in a game with a railroad foreman down on his luck. Thought I'd have a bit of sport. Sent Nem out here to the loneliest rancher in the territory as a joke. Looks like you didn't appreciate the punchline. His eyes glinted with malice as he looked at the sisters. Now, step aside. I'm taking them back to town. Got a buyer lined up already, the younger sister, let out a small, terrified whimper. The elder, Lynn, placed a steadying hand on her shoulder, her gaze locked on Barlow with pure, undiluted hatred. Jonah saw it all, the sheriff's sadism, the sister's terror, the utter depravity of the situation. His moral compass, the one true thing he'd always lived by, pointed in only one direction. He took a half-step forward, planting himself squarely between Barlow and the women. They're on my land now, he stated, the words carrying the weight of an unbreakable vow. And they're not leaving. The air crackled with tension. Barlow's smirk vanished, replaced by a scowl of disbelief, then fury. Are you drawing a line against the law, rancher? He snarled, his hand dropping to his own holstered pistol. Jonah didn't flinch. I'm drawing a line against you. He knew it was a fool's stand, 1 man against 3, but the thought of handing those women over to a man like Barlow was impossible. Suddenly, with a speed that belied his size, Jonah spun on his heel and fired a single shot not at the men, but at the dry, brittle fencing of his nearby horse corral. The sharp crack of the pistol shot, combined with the splintering wood, spooked the animals inside. With a collective snort of panic, half a dozen horses burst through the weakened fence, thundering directly toward the sheriff and his men. It was chaos. Horses reared, deputies shouted, and Barlow fought to control his spooked mount. It was the only diversion Jonah would get. He grabbed Lynn's arm. "Run!" To the cabin, he yelled over the din. For a moment, she hesitated, her eyes questioning, but the urgency in his voice was undeniable. She grabbed Mai's hand and they ran, their feet light on the hard-packed earth. Jonah fired another shot into the air to keep the deputies occupied, then followed, his long strides eating up the distance to the small, sturdy cabin he called home. He slammed the heavy oak door behind them and threw the bolt, the sound echoing the frantic beating of his own heart. He leaned against the wood, breathing heavily, as the sound of angry shouting and retreating hoofbeats faded. Silence fell, thick and heavy, broken only by the sound of their ragged breaths in the dim interior. He was in a fortress of his own making, a stranger in his own home, now sharing it with two women whose names he didn't even know, with the corrupt law of the county hunting them all. The forced proximity was immediate and absolute. The simple, predictable life he craved had just been blown to pieces. Night fell like a shroud over the plains, bringing with it a deceptive quiet. Jonah had given the sisters his own room, a small, sparse space with a single bed and a window facing the open range. He'd taken up a post by the main room's hearth, his rifle across his knees, listening to every creak of the floorboards and every rustle of the wind. He didn't know what to expect. They were fugitives now, all three of them. A little while past midnight, the door to the bedroom opened a crack. It was Lynn, the elder sister. She stepped out, moving with a silent grace that surprised him. She held a small, chipped cup in her hands. She approached him cautiously and offered it. It was tea, fragrant and steaming. He took it, his rough fingers brushing against hers. "Thank you," he said, the words feeling inadequate. She nodded, her expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. She sat on the floor a few feet away, her back straight, a silent sentinel sharing his vigil. "He will come back," she said, her English soft but clear, with an accent that was melodic. Jonah was taken aback. He hadn't expected her to speak the language so well. "I know," he replied, his eyes scanning the darkness outside the window. With more men she was silent for a long time, watching the flames. Then she spoke again, her voice barely a whisper. "He lies?" "Sheriff Barlow." "We were not." One in a game. Jonah turned his full attention to her. "My father was a physician," she continued, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "An herbalist. He made medicines for the railroad workers. Barlow runs an opium trade, smuggling it in the company's supply wagons. My father found out. He threatened to expose him, her hands clenched in her lap. So Barlow framed him. He said my father was a poisoner, that his medicines had killed a man. He took everything. And he took us." The revelation hit Jonah like a physical blow. This wasn't a cruel joke, it was calculated, vicious evil. These women weren't just property to be bartered, they were witnesses to be silenced. His decision at the stagecoach stop, once a simple act of decency, had now become a matter of life and death. He was protecting not just victims, but the key to bringing down a tyrant. The attack came just before dawn, the time when a man's senses are at their dullest. Jonah had been right. Barlow returned with 6 men this time, spreading out to surround the small cabin. The first bullet splintered the wood of the window frame next to Jonah's head, showering him with sharp slivers. He dropped to the floor, rolling behind a heavy wooden table as more shots shattered the glass. "Get down," he yelled towards the bedroom. The crack of rifles was deafening in the small space. He peered over the edge of the table, firing his Winchester methodically, making each shot count. He was a good marksman, raised to hunt on this land, but he was pinned, the odds hopelessly stacked against him. He took down one of the deputies, a lucky shot through the darkness, but 2 more were advancing on the blind side of the cabin, using the woodshed for cover. He had no angle on them. He saw one of them raise his rifle, aiming for the flimsy wall of the bedroom where he knew the sisters were hiding. His blood ran cold. He tried to shift his position to get a clear shot, but another volley of bullets kicked up dirt in front of him, forcing him back down. He was trapped. This was it. And then, something flashed in his peripheral vision. A flicker of movement from the shattered bedroom window. A dark shape arced through the pre-dawn gloom with impossible speed and silence. The deputy aiming at the bedroom wall grunted, a choked, surprised sound. He dropped his rifle and staggered back, clutching at his throat where the handle of a finely balanced throwing knife now protruded. He collapsed into a heap. Jonah stared, dumbfounded. Before the other deputy could even react to his partner's fall, a second knife flew from the window, embedding itself deep in the man's shoulder with a sickening thud. He screamed and fell back, his own rifle discharging harmlessly into the sky. The sudden, lethal precision of the attack stunned Barlow's men into a moment of shocked silence. In that moment, Jonah saw Lynn's face in the window, her expression a mask of cold, focused fury. She was not a helpless victim cowering in a corner. She was a warrior. The realization electrified him, and he used the deputy's hesitation to his advantage, laying down a furious volley of covering fire that sent them scrambling for cover. They had survived the first assault. In the tense quiet that followed the hasty retreat of Barlow's men, the cabin felt both smaller and safer. The immediate threat had passed, but the air was still thick with the smell of gunpowder and the weight of what had just happened. Jonah found Lynn in the bedroom, calmly retrieving her knives from where she'd laid out a small leather roll. Mai was huddled on the bed, her face pale, but her eyes were fixed on her sister with a look of fierce pride. The dynamic between them was clear, one was the shield, the other the heart. Jonah leaned against the doorframe, his rifle held loosely in one hand. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked, his voice rough with awe. Lynn finished wiping a blade clean on a piece of cloth before looking up at him. "My father believed a woman should know how to protect herself," she said simply. "He taught me many things. How to use herbs to heal, and how to use steel to harm." She gestured to a small graze on Jonah's forearm, where a splinter had torn the skin. "Sit," she commanded, her tone leaving no room for argument. She unrolled another part of her kit, revealing small packets of dried herbs and clean bandages. As she worked, her touch surprisingly gentle, she told him more. Her father had been more than a simple herbalist, he was a scholar and a martial artist from a long line of them, forced to flee his homeland. He had trained her not in the loud, brutal ways of the gun, but in the silent, strategic arts of defense. As she tied off the bandage, their eyes met. The space between them was charged with a new understanding. This was no longer his fight alone. They were partners, bound by a shared enemy. They spent the next hours planning, their heads bent over a crude map Jonah drew in the dirt on the floor. He knew the terrain, every ravine, every dry creek bed, every hidden spring. Lynn possessed a sharp, tactical mind, seeing vulnerabilities and opportunities he had overlooked. Mai, who had been silent until now, pointed to a spot on his map. "The riders," she said, her English halting. "When they came, they rode around that ridge. Not over. The ground is bad there. Unstable." It was a small detail, but a critical one. She was an observer, her fear sharpening her senses. They were a three-person team now, the gunman, the strategist, and the scout. Their plan began to form, not one of defense, but of attack. They couldn't win a prolonged siege, and they couldn't outrun Barlow's posse forever. Their only hope was to turn the tables, to use the sheriff's arrogance against him. "He thinks we are trapped animals," Lynn said, her gaze distant as she formulated the plan. "He expects us to run for the mountains, to try and lose him in the high country. We will let him think he is right." The plan was one of misdirection. They would spend the day creating a false trail, a convincing story of a desperate flight towards the jagged peaks to the north. Jonah, an expert tracker himself, knew exactly how to lay down signs that would fool even a seasoned man. He would lead one of his horses, letting its shod hooves leave deep impressions in the softer ground, scuffing rocks and breaking branches in a way that suggested panicked haste. Lynn added a crucial detail. She tore a strip of fabric from Mai's spare dress, a distinctive blue calico. "Leave this on a thorn bush about a mile up the trail," she instructed. Something dropped in a hurry. He will see it as proof of our desperation. While Jonah worked on the false trail, the sisters prepared their own contribution. Mai, using the knowledge her father had passed down, gathered specific plants from around the cabin, plants that, when crushed, left a scent that animals, and a keen-nosed tracker, might follow for a short distance. They would use it to enhance the beginning of the trail, making it seem even more authentic. As they worked together through the day, a quiet rhythm developed between Jonah and Lin. Their communication was sparse, functional, but filled with unspoken understanding. A shared glance over the map, a quick nod of agreement, the simple act of passing a canteen of water, each gesture built upon the foundation of trust forged in the morning's firefight. He saw not just her strength, but her intelligence and grace under pressure. She, in turn, saw the steady, unwavering core of the man who had chosen to stand for them when he could have simply turned away. The sun began to dip low, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The trap was set. Balo would take the bait, they were certain of it. And while he and his men were chasing shadows in the mountains, they would be heading in the opposite direction, back to the heart of his power. Under the sliver of a moon, they moved like ghosts. They traveled south, away from the mountains and the false trail they had so carefully laid. Their destination was the town of Redemption, a place whose name had become a bitter irony under Balo's rule. Jonah led them through dry arroyos and across rocky mesas, his knowledge of the backcountry keeping them hidden from any potential scouts. They left the horses tethered in a hidden gully a mile outside of town, proceeding the rest of the way on foot. The town was dark and quiet, most of its decent folk locked behind their doors, leaving the night to the coyotes and Balo's cronies. Their objective was the sheriff's office, a squat stone building that also served as the town jail. "The proof," Lin whispered, her voice a breath of air beside him as they crouched behind a water trough. "He is too arrogant to destroy it. He will keep a record, a ledger, of all his dealings. My father said it is his one weakness, his vanity. He needs to see his empire written down." They had a second objective as well, to get that ledger into the hands of U.S. Marshal Vance, who was due to arrive in the neighboring county seat of Silver Creek in 2 days. It was their only chance for real justice. Mai was positioned in a darkened loft of the livery stable across the street, a small, polished piece of tin in her hand. Her job was to watch the main road, to signal them with a flash of reflected moonlight if Balo returned unexpectedly. It was a dangerous role, but she had insisted, her quiet determination now a force in its own right. Jonah checked his pistol, the click of the hammer being pulled back unnaturally loud in the silence. Lin drew one of her knives, its blade a sliver of darkness in her hand. They moved across the dusty street, hugging the shadows, their goal just feet away. Jonah worked on the lock of the back office window with a piece of wire from a broken fence post. It took a few tense moments, but then he heard the soft click of the tumblers giving way. They were in. The office smelled of stale cigar smoke and whiskey. A single oil lamp on the desk cast long, menacing shadows. And there, sitting in plain sight on the corner of the desk, was a thick, leather-bound ledger. It seemed too easy. They had the ledger in hand, its pages filled with the damning evidence of Balo's crimes, names, dates, illicit payments for smuggling, and a chillingly brief entry detailing the seizure of the apothecary's assets, which included his 2 daughters. They were just turning to leave when the floorboards of the front porch creaked. A flicker of light flashed from the livery stable, for my signal. But it was too late. The front door of the office burst open and Sheriff Balo stood there, his face a mask of rage. Behind him stood the deputy he'd left as a sentry. "Thought you could outsmart me, did you?" Balo bellowed, his gun already in his hand. "I found your little trail. Looked a bit too perfect." Decided to double back. The showdown wasn't in an open canyon, but here, in this cramped, cluttered room. The deputy moved to flank them, but Jonah was faster. He shoved the heavy desk forward, sending it crashing into the man's legs and knocking him off balance. Jonah's Colt barked once, the shot aimed not to kill but to disable, and the deputy went down, clutching a shattered wrist. But the move left Jonah exposed. Barlow leveled his pistol, a triumphant sneer on his face. End of the line, rancher, but he had forgotten about Lynn. She moved like a viper, using the chaos of the overturned desk as cover. She threw a heavy inkwell, not at Barlow, but at the oil lamp. It shattered, plunging the room into near-total darkness, save for the pale moonlight streaming through the windows. Barlow roared in frustration, firing blindly into the gloom. At that exact moment, a loud crash echoed from across the street. Mai, seeing her sister and Jonah in mortal danger, had shoved a heavy barrel from the loft door. It hit the ground with a sound like a cannon shot. For a critical second, Barlow's head jerked toward the sound, his attention diverted. It was the opening Jonah needed. He lunged through the darkness, his body slamming into the larger man, sending them both crashing through the office window and onto the dusty street outside. The ledger flew from Jonah's hand, skittering across the dirt. They wrestled for control of Barlow's gun, two desperate men fighting in the moonlight. The fight was brutal and raw. Barlow was stronger, his sheer bulk a weapon, but Jonah was quicker, fueled by righteous fury. He managed to twist the sheriff's wrist until the gun clattered to the ground. He landed a solid punch to Barlow's jaw, sending him stumbling back. Just as Jonah scrambled for his own pistol, Barlow drew a concealed knife, its blade gleaming. He lunged, but Lynn was there. She had come through the broken window after them, a dark, silent wraith. She didn't attack Barlow directly but threw one of her own knives with perfect precision, not at him, but at the gun on the ground, sending it spinning away into the shadows, out of reach of either man. The fight was now hand-to-hand. As Barlow turned on her, his rage making him clumsy, Jonah tackled him from behind. The town was stirring now, lights appearing in windows as people, drawn by the gunshots and the commotion, began to cautiously emerge. They saw the three figures locked in a desperate struggle in the middle of their main street. They saw their corrupt sheriff, a snarling animal, fighting a lone rancher and a Chinese woman who moved with the deadly grace of a panther. It was Mai's final act that broke the stalemate. She slid down from the loft and, with a courage she didn't know she possessed, retrieved the fallen ledger. She held it up, her voice clear and strong. Here is the proof of his crimes. Seeing the book, the source of his power and his secrets, in the hands of his victim, seemed to break something in Barlow. His wild charge faltered. In that split second of hesitation, Jonah delivered a final, decisive blow that knocked the wind from the big man and sent him sprawling into the dust, defeated. The townspeople watched in stunned silence as Jonah stood over their tyrant, his chest heaving, not with a gun in his hand, but with the unshakable certainty of justice. A day later, when U.S. Marshal Vance rode into town, he found Sheriff Barlow locked in his own jail cell, a ledger of his crimes sitting on the desk, and a strange, resilient new family standing guard. The charges against the sister's father were cleared, his name restored. Their freedom was absolute. Jonah offered them a home, not as refugees he had saved, but as the partners who had saved him in turn. Months later, the ranch was no longer a monument to one man's loneliness. It was alive. Mai cultivated a sprawling garden, her father's knowledge of herbs and plants blossoming in the rich soil. The scent of healing and hope hung in the air. On the porch of the cabin, Jonah and Lynn stood watching the sunset paint the sky. The silence between them was no longer empty, but filled with a deep, comfortable understanding. He reached for her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. They had faced down a tyrant and forged a new life from the ashes of cruelty and deceit. Here, on this land that had once been so empty, they had built more than a home. They had built a future.